Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the webinar. My name is Phoebe Potter, and I'm with the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Before turning to the webinar today, I'd like to briefly talk through a couple of housekeeping items about how the webinar is going to work, and then take a brief moment to tell you a little bit about the National Reentry Resource Center. Because of the volume of people on the webinar, we will keep all lines on mute for the entirety of the presentation. However, anytime during this webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. We will keep a running list of the content-related questions that we receive, and then ask the panelists to respond to the questions during the last segment of the webinar. We will do our best to get through as many questions as possible. If you encounter any technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues you may not be able to resolve. For this reason, we are recording this event and will post it on our website at www.nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. We should have the webinar posted online early next week, and once it has been posted, we will email you a link to the recording. The National Reentry Resource Center is now in its fourth year of operation. It was established by the Second Chance Act to provide education, training, and technical assistance to states, tribes, territories, local governments, service providers, nonprofit organizations, and corrections institutions working on prisoner reentry. The Resource Center is administered by the Council of State Governments in partnership with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, U.S. Department of Justice. To learn more about NRRC projects, publications, and resources, visit our website or sign up for the Center's monthly newsletter using the link shown here on the slide. We are very proud of all the work that's been happening in the field and want to be able to share that work far and wide. If you have a website, newsletter, or other mechanism for sharing news, please think about including that information and information about the NRRC and how to register for updates. We would love to help you share information with your colleagues and partners. You can direct people to subscribe to the newsletter with the link in the second bullet in the lower left-hand corner of the slide. Or contact us, and we can share you the summary information and links that you can use. I will now introduce our featured panelists. David Zamora is the Director of National Initiatives here at the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and will be moderating the discussion as well as presenting. Dr. Gary Dennis is the Senior Policy Advisor for Corrections at the Bureau of Justice Assistance under the U.S. Department of Justice. Director Wall is the Director of the Rhode Island Department of Corrections, as well as the President of the Association of State Correctional Administrators. Director Jones is the Director of the Oklahoma Department of Corrections and co-chairs the Reentry and Community Corrections Subcommittee within the Association of State Correctional Administrators. Bridget Adams is the Reentry Branch Manager for the Kentucky Department of Corrections, and Tony Streveler is the Director of Research and Policy for the Wisconsin Department of Corrections. We are excited to have such an experienced expert panel today. All of our panelists have been involved in the development of the resources that we will be presenting, for which we are very grateful. The Association of State Correctional Administrators and the Bureau of Justice Assistance have been key partners in the development of these checklists. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to David Zamora to begin our presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome very much to the webinar. I'm very pleased to be able to moderate this distinguished group of panelists that we have with us today. You will see when you look at your screen that our presentation will have a number of components to it today. We'll start in just a moment with Dr. Gary Dennis, who will give an overview of the Recidivism Reduction Checklist project. And from there, we will specifically talk about the State Reentry Coordinators checklist content, and then how to operationalize the checklists, and then what additional support is available for recidivism reduction work, ways to think about this, if you will. And finally, we will end with a period of time to answer any questions that you may have sent as you are listening to this presentation. I would also like to make a note to all of the panelists. Because there are several panelists, I will be moving slides forward for a good period of this presentation. I will do my best as you seem to be ending your slide to move that forward, but please do not feel shy to just say something like, David, move the slide, and I will be happy to make sure that I move it forward. With that, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Gary Dennis to discuss the origins of the Recidivism Reduction Project and where we've come so far. Dr. Dennis?
Thanks very much, David. I also am privileged to have the opportunity to be a part of this webinar, which I think is sort of a precedent-setting event for not only the Bureau of Justice Assistance, but certainly our partners in the Association of State Correctional Administrators and the Council of State Governments. The drafters of the Second Chance Act placed a significant emphasis on recidivism reduction as an indicator of the success of the grant programs funded under the Act. The mark that was set by the Act of a 50% reduction in recidivism over a 5-year period, we all know is an unrealistic goal. And yet we must strive to make significant reductions in recidivism in order to convince the people on Capitol Hill who are funding these projects that the money is being well spent. The Second Chance Act has changed the manner in which we conceptualize and speak about effective reentry programs. We now stress the importance of using evidence-based program strategies and interventions, and the incorporation of risk, needs, responsivity, and dosage principles are gaining wide support in the field. We know that these approaches have positive results when they're implemented with fidelity. As a result of meetings and ongoing discussions with the Association of State Correctional Administrators, it became evident that the heads of state departments of corrections were also concerned about the need to reduce recidivism and were interested in exploring innovative approaches to reentry programming. This led to a national forum held in D.C. in December of 2011. The forum had over 250 participants, including state policymakers, teams from all 50 states. These teams included the Director of Corrections, the State Reentry Coordinator, and a champion, if you will, that could have been a legislator or someone from the governor's staff or a judge, but people who really had taken the issue of reentry to raise, so to speak, and were advocates. It had the strong bipartisan support of both Republican and Democratic leaders in Congress, as well as representatives from various components in the U.S. Department of Justice who participated in the program. It emphasized the working partnerships with states and that were needed to pursue cost-effective strategies and provide a strong return on the investments that were being made through the Second Chance Act. And we now have in excess of 400 grant programs that have been funded to the tune of over $300 million. Now I want to advance the slide, David. Why was the forum so important? Prior to the forum, we sent out a survey to all the state departments of corrections to find out sort of the status of the field. And what we found was that most of the states were still struggling with how to develop plans and how to implement strategies that would help them to reduce recidivism. The forum itself was an action-oriented event that was designed to help participants set measurable goals for reducing recidivism, design plans to achieve these goals by drawing on the strongest research and experiences from the field, and to identify benchmarks that state and federal policymakers can use to track the progress. Coming out of the forum, BJA decided to develop a grant track to help states tackle these challenges. After a national competition, 7 state departments of corrections received grants of up to $1 million to implement evidence-based strategies designed to impact a reduction in their statewide recidivism rates. The National Reentry Resource Center is providing targeted technical assistance to these 7 states, including using the checklist that you will be discussing today to help support these efforts and further the work of these 7 states. BJA is also anticipating, as a result of this ongoing work, to have another project of national import that we will hopefully, once we have some decisions about our 2013 budget, to place out there on the streets. So these 7 projects were direct outgrowths of the forum. Many other positive outcomes have come out of this historic convening, primarily the checklist that you all will be talking about. And so now I think I'll pass the baton back to David and to Justin to elaborate on the significance of our checklists.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dennis. And in fact, we would like to ask Director Jones, followed by Director Wall, to talk a bit about some of the following slides, beginning with some additional takeaways from the forum. So, Director Jones?
Yeah, thank you, David, and I appreciate the comprehensiveness of your slides, Gary. If you look at the current slide, These are some takeaways from the forum that the aforementioned forum that was explained to you. After the forum, the Justice Center and the Association of State Correctional Administrators, also known as ASCA, we surveyed state leaders on their experiences in reducing recidivism and their experiences at the forums. This particular graph shows how many states were setting recidivism reduction targets, had a statewide plan for reducing recidivism, and or were tracking recidivism both before and then after the forum that was held in D.C. As you can see from the charts, the forum led to a large increase in the number of states that wanted to set reduction targets and develop statewide plans for meeting those targets. Also, however, many of these activities are still in progress, and indications are that additional guidance is needed in several jurisdictions to assist in achieving certain goals that were set. In response, ASCA and the Justice Center brought together state policymakers and correctional leaders to discuss how we can best assist states to develop these plans. That meeting involved a group of lawmakers, correctional directors, who brainstormed ways to provide accessibility, useful information on best practices, how to guide our peers around the country to realistically track recidivism rates and target offenders and be accurate with the evidence base that's provided in what you're going to see later on in the checklist. It was during this meeting that the concept of recidivism reduction checklist was actually created. And I think at this point I'll let Director Wall go ahead and go into those checklists.
Director Wall?
Yes, David, and thank you, Justin. As you can see, there were 3 checklists that were ultimately developed as a result of the work that began at the forum that Dr. Dennis described. And there are 3 of them, and the reason is that they each correspond to one of the 3 participants from each of the 50 jurisdictions. The executive level policymaker, champion as it were, state corrections administrators, and of course the reentry coordinators. And our goal was to harness the enthusiasm and commitment that was demonstrated at that forum and to translate it into concrete, measurable action steps, if you will, to put some form to the fire that was generated. The drafts were, as Director Jones said, vetted by a number of the state corrections directors, and I would like to unpack them a little bit for you. What you'll see, of course, in this slide are the goals across the checklist and the steps that need to be taken. The upper level is the guide to our leadership, legislative, executive, and so forth. Since leadership sets the direction for policy. In addition, at the lower level, that direction is translated into goals for us as administrators, reentry coordinators, and others working on reentry as a means to reduce recidivism. They are aligned to make sure that we are all speaking a common language, but clearly they also speak to different roles and responsibilities depending on what our job is in connection with recidivism reduction. For that reason, the level of detail changes significantly across the 3 checklists that you saw on the previous slide. What is true is this, that we know these goals reflect the collective knowledge gained over the years about what are best practices and what's needed from a management perspective. Certainly, at root, the requirement that recidivism reduction be made an agency-wide priority and that accountability for accomplishing that mission be clear and specified.
Thank you very much, Director Wall. We're going to now move into the content in the Reentry Coordinators checklist in particular. This is where we'll start to unpack things a bit for folks for the rest of this conversation this afternoon. First of all, let me just go through very briefly the goals in terms of the State Reentry Coordinators checklist. The first is to clearly make recidivism reduction an agency priority and to set reduction goals for specific programs or policy changes, to focus resources on the individuals who are most likely to reoffend, to establish programs and practices that have been shown to reduce recidivism and ensure that they are implemented with fidelity. It's not just enough to have programs, they need to be programs that relate to recidivism reduction, and it's not just enough to have programs that relate to recidivism reduction, but they need to be implemented the way that they were developed to be utilized. 4, to implement community supervision policies and practices that promote successful reentry. So not just the issue of what happens in the institution, of course, but what happens in the community, and not surprisingly to anyone on the phone, I'm sure, what happens in that transition from the institution to the community. And then measuring recidivism-related outcomes and establishing a reporting process that really promotes accountability for the results. So let me just take a few minutes now to briefly review some of the research that backs these goals. These are goals that we discussed for a long period of time, that we thought through very carefully in terms of the development of these checklists, and it is very much based on the available evidence that we have. Let's start with the evidence of focusing on higher risk individuals. And there are multiple studies out there, but we will show you this particular one from Lowenkamp and Matessa from just a few years ago in 2005. And what it looked at is the issue of the way that Ohio was utilizing halfway houses to promote reentry. And they were really looking at the issue of efficacy of the programming in those halfway houses as a function of the level of risk of the offender. And they compared 3,500 offenders placed in the halfway houses to 3,500 that were not placed in a halfway house. And what they found, to put it very simply, was that when they focused services on folks that were low risk, not only didn't they help them, they actually tended to make them worse. That if they focused on the low moderate folks, they helped them. It was a little bit better than nothing, but it wasn't very high. That where they began to see the significant impact is when they were focusing on the moderate, sometimes called high moderate group, and on the high group. And you can see, just following the bars right across the slide in front of you, that the lower the risk, the more problematic the intervention or the less effective the intervention, and the higher the risk, the more appropriate and the more successful the interventions in responding. So what are those interventions focusing on? Well, there's the issue of addressing criminogenic needs. And again, I'm certain that many, if not all, folks on this call are aware of what criminogenic needs are, that they come out of the concept of risk, need, and responsivity that you've heard the directors discussing already. Nevertheless, what we find in many jurisdictions is that decisions are still not being, either not being made or being made only in certain areas, or being made but not made well in the sense of the ability to, in the sense of the ability to determine what risk level the individual is. When we look at the issue of responding to criminogenic needs, we're talking about the variables that have been shown to have an impact in terms of what will increase the likelihood of someone to recidivate, to commit a new crime, or to fail in supervision. And what happens sometimes is that jurisdictions get concerned because there are a number of them. We know there's the big 8. We know that there's 4 in particular that are the really big ones, if you will. And we know that focusing on all of them appropriately is what we should do. But sometimes that can be overwhelming. There are always resource issues. There are always issues about the number of folks that can be focused on. One of the very nice things about the slide that you now see in front of you is that it's not an issue of all or nothing. First of all, what this does show us is that when you don't focus on criminogenic criminogenic needs, or if you focus on things that are non-criminogenic, that you either have no impact or you have a negative impact in terms of recidivism reduction. If you focus on just one, you begin to see a statistically significant drop in recidivism. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, the more you focus on, the better your outcomes. But there isn't a reason to say, because I can't focus on 6 or 7 or 8, that I should focus on none. Focusing on 1, 2, or 3 will give a significant improvement, and certainly far better than either doing nothing or focusing on responses that are not related to criminal behavior. This is all based, of course, on the research around the risk, need, and responsivity principle. The issue of risk being what is the likelihood of somebody recidivating. And just as a side note, many people still don't specify or are not clear that the issue of risk has to do with the likelihood of future recidivism. Many places still confuse the concept of risk of recidivism and degree of dangerousness. While dangerousness is a real issue, it is a separate issue from the discussion of risk, need, and responsivity, and certainly needs to be assessed, but it is a different assessment than the risk of recidivism. And then there's the issue of need. What are the dynamic variables that can be impacted to lower the risk? And then there's the issue of responsivity. What are the best ways to get this material to individuals? How do we respond? What is the best type? Once again, when you look at this, if you focus on just one principle, you go from a negative to a positive in terms of outcomes. If you focus on 2 principles, you see a significant improvement. And of course, if you focus on 3, you get the best. So it's not that all of them have to happen at once. Getting started focusing on any one of them, and typically what we start with, of course, is the issue of risk, right? Just sorting folks by risk gives us an improved set of outcomes. Then developing the programming and response really is where we begin to see the difference, right? That second piece. And then the third one, being better around responsivity. And there are 2 issues when we look at this issue of responsivity. One is general responsivity. We already know that the best interventions tend to be cognitive interventions. But then there's all the individual responsivity issues that might have to do with cultural issues, gender issues, age issues, cognitive issues, mental illness issues, substance abuse issues, because substance abuse can be both a criminogenic risk issue and a responsivity issue. And so obviously the more of those that we attend to, the more effective we are in helping folks to assimilate or improve from the programming that is utilized. And then in terms of the next step about research behind the goals, we're looking at the issue of program quality and fidelity. And fundamentally, the greater the degree of fidelity, the better the outcome. You have much more effective outcomes when you have something planned in terms of assuring fidelity of programming. So what does that mean? Well, it means a few different things. You can see easily in terms of the slide that I have just put in front of you that if you do not pay attention to quality and fidelity, you have some very unsatisfactory outcomes. That the more that you pay attention, the better off you are in terms of outcomes. There are a couple of different components to this issue, though. The first one, of course, is a workforce development issue, just the simple issue of training individuals to do this appropriately. That's not just training how, but having people understand the why. The second problem, if you will, or the second issue that has to be paid attention to is that given turnover in workforces, it has to be an ongoing type of training. We cannot do it once and then hope that it will just stay. The third issue is that there has to be very active supervision of that over time. Left to their own devices, folks will slide away from it, and it's just natural. It has nothing to do with folks being good or bad. And then the fourth issue has to do with accountability, which means that it has to be built into how we assess not just the measurement of programs, but how we assess staff, how we measure our staff and what we look at in terms of expectations of staff and what their what their annual evaluations, their staff evaluations involve in terms of their ability to do this programming and to have fidelity to the goals of the work. Moving on to another piece here, what we have is the issue when we move from, say, programming and treatment responses to supervision responses. Once again, we have some interesting data out there, and this comes from EOS and others in a meta-analysis they did in 2006, though it's been replicated since. And fundamentally, what it comes down to, and we're using fairly straightforward pictures here for speed, if you will, but fundamentally what it comes down to is if all we do is watch folks, it does not work. That there needs to be a treatment-oriented response. And so what does treatment-oriented mean? What it means, of course, is an engagement response. It doesn't mean that we don't surveil people. It doesn't mean that we don't do our function in terms of assuring community safety. What it means is that if we're interested in long-term community safety, that the best impacts, the highest effects come from having an engagement response, pulling offenders in, and having a goal, if you will, in terms of our supervision, not of catching them, but of changing them, or specifically helping them to change as they move forward. Now, having said that, I would also make the point that we have research that shows pretty quickly that when there is a problem, it needs to be responded to quickly. That if there's an issue where somebody is not doing what they need to do under supervision, ignoring that, dragging that out, giving them second, third, and fourth chances tends to be very ineffective. There really needs to be what these days are called swift and certain sanctions in terms of responses. But once again, a bit of a side note, this is predicated on the concept that in addition to a swift and certain sanction when there's a problem, that there are swift and certain positive reinforcements when things are going well. And so the importance of understanding this model is not let's get them quickly. The importance is let's make sure that we're rewarding them for appropriate pro-social behavior and doing what they need to be doing. And let's make sure that when they're doing the wrong thing that we respond with a consequence immediately. That consequence certainly may not be, in fact in many instances probably should not be, a violation back to the institution, but it will need to be some type of response that makes it very clear and very quick that there's a consequence to the problem behavior, hopefully very quickly then followed by behavioral responses in terms of positively responding to the individual as their behavior changes. Now, there are some principles that underlie the checklist goals, and again, I want to mention those fairly quickly here. The first one is that there's a focus on changing offender behavior, as no doubt does not surprise you given the slides that I've just gone through. Secondly, that the management of offenders needs to be goal and data-driven, and that management of the programs, of institutions, of supervision needs to be goal and data-driven, that staff must receive appropriate and ongoing training, and that there must be quality assurance, oversight, and accountability to ensure fidelity to the programming. And again, hopefully, though I've gone through it fairly quickly, the slides that I've just reviewed with you clearly show you the backdrop for how we came to these principles and developed them. Now, just as a couple of points here, because there are so many policies and practices in the checklist, there's 60 of them, we are not going to try to talk through all of them individually. Rather, we've asked the panel to talk about these 4 principles. Also, as a point of clarification, you won't see these principles explicitly referred to in the checklists. These are really these serve as the way to summarize the different types of performance and policy expectations that you see across the 5 goals that I mentioned, and as a way to help organize in terms of folks thinking around what are the goals of the checklist and what is it that we are attempting to move them toward. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Director Wall to talk about the first principle of changing offender behavior. Director Wall?
Thank you, David. As David has said, the principles that he's just described, those 4 principles from the previous slide, are threaded through the 5 goals. And the point here is to look at how these 5 goals, goals that are framed in language that is directly reflected in the checklists for the Reentry Coordinators and associated staff, to see how those goals relate to the principles David identified. The first principle, for example, being changing offender behavior. So as an example, there are goals 2, 3, and 4 on your checklist, and if you're looking at the checklist, you'll see them. And those goals are all organized to support the principle of changing offender behavior. For example, goal 2, the importance of assessment to determine the dynamic criminogenic risk factors that need to be addressed through programming. Clearly, all individuals need to be assessed for risk of recidivism. Those who are moderate and high risk must be assessed to determine which risk factors need to be addressed through programming. For example, we know that one of the major indicators of risk to reoffend is antisocial thinking, and we know what that looks like. Somebody saying, I'm the victim here, or she deserved it, or no one tells me what to do. Those would be examples of the kind of factors that need to be considered in antisocial thinking, or examples of it. That risk assessment does need to drive case management decisions, including program referrals and placements. Similarly, goal number 3, which again is that the need to establish programs and practices shown to reduce recidivism and ensure that they are implemented with fidelity. You'll see that goal in your checklist as well. And that, of course, means that there need to be high-quality programs based in evidence that are going to address the factors that make individuals more likely to reoffend. Let me say that there are, of course, challenges with implementing these goals. Take the first goal, that of assessing moderate high-risk offenders. The fact is that we have a certain amount of resources, and we need to prioritize those for the higher risk levels, even though those offenders may not be the easiest people with whom to work. Similarly, looking at goal 3, how do we make sure that the risk assessment actually informs the case plans, avoiding the disconnect between the risk assessment, which goes in the file, and the case plan, which actually isn't being derived from and informed by that risk assessment. Finally, as a last example, goal 4, which is that, of course, community supervision policies and practices must be put into place that will promote successful reentry. That is a case not only of informing probationers and parolees of the sanctions for behaviors, but also specific incentives, that we give our community corrections staff the ability to modify conditions of supervision in response to changes, and that incentives are delivered immediately as well. So all of that requires a certain style of communication, which is also contemplated by this goal. Techniques that promote intrinsic motivation, open-ended questions, or questions that reflect back what the offender is saying. For example, it sounds as if you want your children to be proud of you. And also taking advantage of those informal social controls, family and community members who are really sort of the front line of defense against recidivism.
Thank you very much, Director Wall. We're going to move to Principle 2. Just before I do that, let me just remind folks that you have the ability to type in questions on your screen, and that we will be looking at those through the presentation, and as we get to the question and answer time, we'll be happy to respond to as many as we can. So just a reminder that that is possible, and that you should do that as the presentation is being done. Therefore, we won't sort of have it all connect up together at the end and everyone attempting to write in at the same time. With that, I'd like to talk about Principle 2, which is goal and data-driven management. More specifically, I'd like to ask Director Jones to take some time and to discuss this principle with all of you.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, AT, for leading into this particular slide. And I wanted to start off by just saying the analogy here, I think, in a correctional environment is that we always say at a correctional facility, every staff member is part of security. Every staff member understands that everything they say and do involves security, whether that's modeling behavior or watching activities, etc. So keep that in mind as the analogy, because when we talk about goal and data-driven management, as you referred to the slide that's now in front of your screen, A lot of times research in science and criminal justice doesn't marry very well because so many things are done from emotion and anecdotal cases as with sentencing guidelines or enhancing punishments. Here, with the checklist and what's been created by the Justice Center and ASCA and the other partners involved in this is something that really is data-driven, but what we have to do is ingrain this into our culture. Corrections can provide public safety in many forms, and we do that by obviously not allowing escapes and things of that sort, and trying to reduce violations on parole and walkaways from halfway houses. But the biggest way and the biggest part of public safety for any correctional system is reducing recidivism, because when you reduce recidivism, you thereby reduce future victimization, and in a way of setting those goals is ingraining that into your culture. That's why setting realistic goals that are measured and driven by data is critical. And I think with this checklist and what we're doing in statewide reduction of recidivism is probably more applicable and can be more systemically applied than anything else we've done with data and research in criminal justice. And so such data-driven goals must become ingrained in our organizational culture, where all staff can articulate what they do that contributes to the goal of reducing recidivism. And this starts from the top down and from the bottom up. The very fact that systemic process is in place to reduce recidivism provides a vehicle for a paradigm shift. And it's not so much that you're going to change your culture. This is really a paradigm shift. And there are lots of ways to approach it. But it's really kind of a wraparound process of the culture of your organization. And certainly evidence-based checklist is a great start for this. I also think you have to be cautious about targets and data being misunderstood by policymakers and the public. So statewide efforts among a variety of stakeholders is critical to address recidivism reduction. It requires transparency. It requires open dialogue with victim groups, law enforcement, prosecutors, and other criminal justice entities for them to also understand that reducing recidivism is the ultimate way of providing enhancement to public safety. So it's really critical that you reach out and you collaborate, even with non-traditional collaborators, whether it's inmate support groups or advocacy groups, ACLU, et cetera. Get everybody engaged in the common goal of leaving the next generation better than what we found the current generation by reducing recidivism, where you also change that intergenerational cycle of incarceration, and you certainly affect the children of incarceration by reducing recidivism with their parents. And there's all kinds of collateral benefits to society from that. So with that, the goal of data-driven management is really one of the most comprehensive aspects of this checklist. And with that, we'll pass it on to the next presenter.
Okay. Thank you very much, Director Jones. And I would now like to ask Bridget Adams to please talk a little bit about the third principle, and that principle, of course, is staff training. So, Bridget?
Thank you, David. Staff training has to be a priority in any process when you're introducing a new opportunity throughout your department. One of the biggest things that correctional agencies need to do is ensure that they have plenty of funding set aside for this purpose. For example, funding needs to be set aside to train staff on specific reentry tools like assessment, case planning, special population needs, motivational interviewing. And not only do we need to make sure that we have funding available for that initial training cost, but also remember that we need to have ongoing booster-type trainings to meet the needs of the population of our staff, to ensure that they are effectively trained year after year. As we all know that once you get training, it's not a one-shot deal. We need to make sure that staff keep up with the latest trends in corrections, as well as that they maintain their skills that they learned initially through the first type of training. So that helps, once we have the first training, to have ongoing booster training sessions to keep momentum going and ensure that the message is not lost in the nitty-gritty of the implementation. I can tell you for Kentucky, we implemented risk needs and assessment tool, and we trained over 1,000 staff in about a year and a half. Now we're looking at, okay, it's time to make sure that that training stuck and that we're still training people in the same, keeping the fidelity to the model, as well as ensuring that everyone is assessing individuals at the same level, and that'll be coming soon for our staff. And that really just helps to keep that quality assurance in place, to make sure that staff are scoring assessment tools the same way they did the week after their training that they do a year later, and then maybe again after a booster session. Other things to consider are different models of training. We can do a train the trainer, which is always useful for an agency that wants to have ongoing training, but bringing in outside experts is sometimes more effective because it's helpful when you're trying to emphasize how your state is moving toward a new national norm. We have been lucky enough to receive some grant funds to enable us to bring in some outside speakers that have some expertise so that our staff not only hear that what we're doing is in line with what other states are doing, but also that we have other folks throughout the nation that struggle with the same issues we do. We also encourage web-based training. Like today, we have some folks, like many of the other states, participating in the webinar. So we support ongoing topics of interest to staff at all levels. And the key is also to involve staff at all levels. A lot of times agencies forget that the frontline staff need to have the same training, or at least the same information, as folks at a higher level of supervision, so that we make sure that everyone is on the same page. I can tell you that for us it was difficult to get those 1,000 people trained. We have been able to incorporate the training now into our basic academy. So before we did a strong push to train folks on our case management planning tools, assessment tools, special populations, and motivational interviewing, but now we have that as part of our basic academy. It takes time. We can't train all our staff overnight on all the same tools. We took over a year to get our existing staff trained in the assessment tool. So I would really emphasize that agencies set aside funding, that they really provide the opportunity for their staff to learn more about how implementation is happening, and then also ensure that that quality assurance is built into the training so that there is a quality loop review as staff continue to implement the process.
Thank you very much, Bridget. And just again to remind folks, that was Bridget Adams, who is the Reentry Branch Manager in the Kentucky Department of Corrections. I'd like to now ask Tony Strevler, who's the Director of Research and Policy at the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, to talk a bit about Principle 4, that being quality assurance, oversight, and accountability. So, Tony, if you would be so kind.
Very good. Thank you, David. On your slide, you'll see 3 of the goals that are in the checklist itself. There are a number of other items included in the checklist when you get a chance to look at these that deal with establishing and maintaining a process for continuous quality improvement or system feedback loop. It's called different things in different places. But not just for only administrative purposes, but to moreover provide regular and constructive feedback, concrete feedback to practitioner and staff level. Basically monitoring the delivery of services, fidelity to evidence-based practices, and hopefully helping to build a common commitment to these principles and practices. On the slide, you'll see there's 3 items there, that one dealing with the supervisors observing the assessment process, in essence to ensure that staff are conducting assessments correctly, that they're using collateral contact information to verify the assessment, the offender sufficiently engaged in the assessment process, case planning process, items are scored in accordance with established guidelines, etc. Other states as well, I know we are also contemplating doing inter-rater reliability tests, and also monitoring our overrides on our risk assessments to see how well they're actually being implemented and how much they are being overridden. David very well talked about the second item on the slide where we're talking about fidelity, conducting annual program quality assessments. such as using the correctional program checklist, where in essence asking us, so how are we doing? Are programs being delivered as designed, and are they adhered to evidence-based practices? And the third is a review process, or recommending a review process, kind of a multi-level review process for approving and moving forward with revocation actions. In essence, kind of implementing the principle of swift, sure, and proportionate sanctions on this. I don't know if this happens in other states, but I was just confronted just 2 nights ago that there's a belief in our community that agents in and of themselves, they just make independent, capricious decisions in making revocations. And when in fact I explained to them we have multiple levels of review. We actually have a violation grid that we use. That is not one independent person. Matter of fact, it's up to 4, and sometimes including the court. So having such a practice is really helpful, and it's something I learned here that we need to communicate more with our community. Although this may be only unique in Wisconsin, and you talk about all these principles of holding folks accountable and doing quality assurance, etc. Particularly when you deal with the large organizations like corrections, it can be somewhat of an arduous task, onerous, and sometimes seem almost impossible given the amount of other things we have to do. In some cases, it may even come under the other duties as assigned role, or we don't have enough staff to do this. That's been the case here in Wisconsin, I could say. It's been changing over the last few administrations where they're saying we have to be able to do these kinds of things in terms of quality assurance, collecting data, reporting data out, making sure it's accurate and reliable, so that we're getting not only feedback loops to our legislators, but our administration, but more importantly to our staff. An example of this where we had great intentions of implementing the fidelity model and using the corrections program checklist. We contracted with the University of Cincinnati. They came out here. They've been fantastic helping us out. We actually conducted CPC evaluations on adult prison programs, juvenile programs, and contracted community programs. So some of the lessons we learned on that was that it's really important to communicate the intent right at the upfront. This is not a gotcha. This is not where if you score badly on a report card, we're going to cut your funding or reallocate your staff. And some of the reaction was like that. We also learned that we needed to fully engage those who are being assessed right at the upfront. They need to know the intent. They need to know what we're going to do with the information. We needed to have to ensure that there was sufficient commitment to ongoing work with them after the assessment. You just didn't conduct the assessments, provide the program with the results or the report card, and then walk away. And then lastly, we learned very quickly that we needed a commitment to doing action plans to improve the deficits. Commitment to providing staff training, what Bridget was talking about, any assistance and technical assistance, commitment in doing reassessments in the future. So these things can be very arduous, to say the least, time-consuming, and sometimes anxiety-producing, but it's absolutely necessary and worth the time because it helps not only confirm and document things that we need to work on, but also does things that documenting things that we're doing well and good practice and giving that feedback back to our staff. It also identifies individuals as system training needs. It helps confirm application of good policy and procedures within the agency. It helps us be able to communicate that to policymakers. It helps us measure progress towards stated goals and objectives of the agency. And frankly, the process of engaging in these type of actions here in terms of quality assurance provides tangible results, documented information, verifiable. Hopefully, it's just not talking, but walking the implementation route of recidivism reduction practices. Turn it back to you, David.
Thanks, Tony, very much. And I really appreciate the comments you were making in terms of the issue of needing to have a set of parameters about how to focus on overrides. We certainly know that risk tools are anchors, that they are important for decision making, and that we need to follow the results of that. We also know that there are times that, for very good reasons, there needs to be an override, but that there has to be clarity over that. We see in many jurisdictions a very, very high number of overrides that's essentially rendering the use of the risk tools ineffective. And what's important is that supervisors be involved, that there be clear policy about what the parameters for overrides are, and that there be ongoing discussion with folks about how to utilize that and how to do that. So thanks for bringing that up and mentioning that. So what you've all heard now are various components of the checklists and the principles that underlie them and the goals. And so now that you have a fairly reasonable idea of what's in them, the question comes up, well, okay, so how do we use them? And how does one operationalize these checklists? And there are a number of things to think about. First one is the issue of how do you lead the implementation, right? How do you get it going and move it forward? And in order to really effectively implement the checklist, then reentry coordinators are really going to be needing assistance from key personnel, which means that the staff involved have to have some level of decision-making authority. So the reentry coordinators really need the support of their directors in moving this forward and getting this message to throughout the departments, throughout the agencies, that this is the direction that we're going. And they'll need help from the various administrators, from certainly mid-level management and all the program managers, from the frontline supervisors, from the folks that are responsible for doing training, for all the other folks that are involved in reentry coordination, not just in institutions, but obviously also parole officers in the community. If it's split sentence, then working with probation as well in the community. The human resource staff, given some of the things you were hearing about assessment and evaluation, about evaluation of personnel, and of course the research staff in terms of assessment and evaluation of programming. The Reentry Coordinator Checklist is designed to be a dynamic document. You can record important information in them about implementation, including who's responsible for overseeing the implementation of a particular policy or a particular practice, as well as the status of the implementation. So if you look at this issue of how is it implemented, the first issue is how do you get it going? The next issue is now how is it going, right? How are we doing? Once the key personnel are identified and the reentry coordinator is working closely with those individuals, we need to look at if the policy or performance expectations are currently being implemented, how are they being implemented? Not at all. Not implemented but planned, partially implemented, fully implemented, for example. Once the checklist is complete, it needs to be revisited and updated periodically, of course. Results should inform the administrators of needed policy and practice changes, as well as training needs. And agencies really should develop a plan to address those deficiencies with very specific timelines and goals. So in terms of talking about this a little bit further, the next panel discussion will consist of some different ways that departments of corrections can use these checklists, and by that I mean all three of these checklists as tools. And we'll start with outreach and education, and once again I will ask Director Wall to please discuss a bit about how it is that these can be used in this fashion.
I think that the checklists can be particularly effective as a tool for informing, educating, and reaching out to the multiple audiences with whom we deal. Let's face it, everybody has an opinion about what we in corrections are doing, and also an opinion about what we should be doing to reduce recidivism. And these checklists give us a framework and a structure and talking points such that we are in charge of that conversation. They communicate that we know what we're doing and we know what we need. And they allow us to speak with authority. And the fact is that we will be speaking with authority and we'll sound really smart, because what we're talking about comes from proven, tested methods. And that's true regardless of who our audience is. Communicating to the public, to advocates, to victims, talking about what really needs to be done if we want to make a dent in recidivism and enhance public safety. Similarly, our own legislative and executive leaders and policymakers, describing to them what it is that is required and why, will help us convince them that the money that they are going to fund and the organizational support that they give us is going to be directed to what makes a difference. And frankly, even our own staff, be they custody and security staff or programming personnel or community corrections employees, also have their ideas and their opinions. In fact, Tony's example of the different takes on revocation was, I thought, illuminating and illustrative of the larger point. If we rely on what these checklists have distilled from the body of research and evidence and practice that we've accumulated now over the years, then I think that we can be especially compelling voices and can shape the conversation and support and garner the support we need to get the results.
Thank you very much, Director Walt. And we will move on to another way of using the checklists, which is that of assessment. And we have asked Bridget Adams to kindly share some of her thoughts regarding how these checklists can be used in that fashion.
Thank you, David. The checklists are going to give agencies an opportunity to share this with their frontline staff as well as executive level staff to kind of develop a baseline that will enable you to review where you are and where you need to go. It's really helpful to have the implementations, the 4 different implementation statuses, the not at all implemented, or you're not implemented but you're planning, or you're partially implemented or fully implemented, because I think that we can use it at all levels. Basically, are we perceived in the same way at the institutional level or in the field as we are at central office? I can tell you as a central office person that sometimes I think that we're doing well and we're effectively communicating to frontline staff, and then when we do assessments like this and get an opportunity to take a step back, we have staff in the field that go, no, that's not what our perception is. For example, in the checklist for state reentry coordinators in Goal 1, there's a clear discussion about effective communication about the value of recidivism reduction across all lines of staff. And so that would be a really helpful one to just kind of run by your frontline staff as well as staff at all varying levels within an institution, within a field services district, as well as within central office. And then we also have to consider how often are we going to use these checklists. If you're actively implementing some new procedures or say you're implementing an assessment tool, it might be useful to utilize the checklist on a semi-annual basis. If you've gotten some of those things under your belt, it might be useful to review them on an annual basis with an executive group of folks. So I think that the timing can really be dependent upon what is being accomplished at the time. So whether or not those not planned or not implemented but planned activities, if they're starting to be partially implemented, then it might be helpful to share that information, like Tony was saying, as part of a decision-making process to make sure that legislators and other key stakeholders are informed about what the work of reentry really is in your state. I'll throw it back to you, David.
Sure, thanks, Bridget. Director Jones, I wonder if you might discuss a bit about the use of the checklists as strategic planning tools.
Well, certainly, and I'm going to move fairly quickly because I noticed we want to allow as much time as possible for questions from those online with us today. But strategic planning shouldn't be anything new to people in criminal justice and particularly corrections. Each state, each jurisdiction, in most cases, requires a 1-year plan, a 5-year plan for strategic planning. This checklist really gives you some guidelines that will allow you or enable you a holistic view of reentry and recidivism reduction, much like the strategic planning that created all of this when we had our national forum on reentry and recidivism, which was the beginning of this conversation today. These checklists, when it comes to strategic planning, really is intended to engage and educate policymaking at various levels, whether that's the executive branch, the judicial branches of government. It's not only a way to educate these groups, but a way to engage in an understanding about the reduction in recidivism and the dividends that pays, not only to workforce development, and other things that we've mentioned previously on the slides about the cycle of intergenerational incarceration and eliminating future victimization. It also can be used to add to an agency's or any association's vision and mission and objectives, because the ultimate goal of any correctional system is to reduce recidivism. That's the ultimate outcome. And this really kind of helps you whether you label those objectives that will, if done correctly, will lead to that outcome, or if you call them process measures that will, obviously lead to the same outcome. But these checklists, they're a way to communicate with community providers and service contractors. So correctional people that are outsourcing some reentry, that's going to help reduce recidivism, gives them a guide for best practices. It's something you can use in contracting to do quality assurance. And the list is a long array of issues that you can address with the reentry checklist. And I guess lastly, staff evaluation and staff development, which has already been mentioned. Certainly, staff can be held accountable for certain process measures and certain objectives that lead to the ultimate outcome of recidivism. So it goes back to a cultural paradigm shift, and it goes back to a big umbrella of strategic planning that incorporates the ultimate, in my opinion, and that is reducing recidivism.
Thanks, Director Jones. And speaking of oversight, Tony, I wonder if you might talk a bit about how this checklist can be used for oversight.
Thank you, David. I'll try to be short, following Director Jones's lead on that. It's not usually within my character. I want to key on one thing that Bridget had to say that I was going to point out in use of the checklist. The Wisconsin DOC, as an example, had to use a checklist that's been out there for evidence-based practices. And one thing to share on this, it really was helpful. That's one, helping us develop our strategic plan following in Director Jones's comments. But two, when we went through it at an executive level, and we did independent ratings, and we came together, and then we collectively talked about our ratings, it was amazing to see how we saw things differently when we were reading the same thing. That led to interesting conversations about how we actually communicated amongst ourselves, and then moreover, how do we communicate to our staff our goals and objectives, what we expect, what's the outcome that's taking place, etc. So we also use this other checklist to have our field staff do this as well. And what we found out was also interesting between, I think Bridget was saying, the central office and the field, that I think the central office appeared to be a little bit more critical. Maybe we didn't know what was going on, but we're a little more critical about how things are actually moving forward with certain areas versus the field saying, I think we're doing pretty good. Anyway, this checklist could be another way of bridging some of those gaps in this communication, and also helping us with the overall oversight of our certain strategic plan and moving forward. Is indicated on the slide as well, you could use elements, in fact, many elements of the checklist to develop key performance indicators, outcome measures, etc., and in essence to kind of take the pulse of how well we're moving forward with certain goals and objectives. And in some cases then develop and implement a reporting mechanism, an ongoing reporting mechanism, some certain things. An example of that, in Wisconsin, last year and a half, we've been in the process of implementing on a system-wide and statewide, and that's both adult prisons, community corrections, and juvenile corrections, and in the community, a single risk needs assessment tool. One of the questions in going through some of this is how we would set expectations. And one of the checklists indicated here that risk and needs assessment needs to be taken upon intake to confinement or supervision. But you could use the checklist then to basically say, well, if that's the case, what's our policy? Within a certain period of time upon intake, an assessment should be taking place. So we're actually in the process of setting up now a baseline where we're at with an established target goal of 100% that are done within an established time frame. Another quick example of it is that in the checklist, they talk about targeting higher risk offenders, and that was discussed earlier as well, and for our more intensive treatment programs. So we're in a process of almost finalizing now, is establishing a baseline. So over the last 3 years, One of the folks who actually got into primary programs at adult institutions, who completed those programs, what was their assessed risk, with a low, moderate, or high, what's their distribution. Using that then as the baseline to measure into the future with our goal to say if it's a high percentage of low-risk individuals in the past, we want that percentage to go down and we want the higher percentage to go up. Just a way of, taking a pulse. And the last thing is the R word, the recidivism word. Of course, you got to measure recidivism, and I noticed we've seen in the original slide about 91% of the DOCs are doing that. Defining those, and it actually says in the checklist for the state corrections administrators, and you first got to come with a common definition. This can be a challenge. The Association of State Correctional Administrators, ASCA, has done a great job in setting some good standards on the performance-based measurement system, and it's a good starting point on this thing. The reason why I bring this up is that, at least in our experiences in Wisconsin, it took us a long time. It took a lot of machinations and all kinds of stuff to say what really is recidivism, studying it left and right, and ultimately having a dialogue with decision makers, policymakers at the legislative level, and community level, and say, how would you define recidivism? And finally, our director has decided we're going to move forward with this and then establish a means that's verifiable, replicable, and defensible so that we report it consistently from this point forward. Bottom line, the last part of this is that these checklists, at least in the area of oversight, sets kind of a common language between legislative and executive policymakers, corrections administrators, and sets a language of definitions, goals, measurement tools, and measurement methodologies to get buy-in and common buy-in and understanding of where we're at today and where we're going and how we're getting there to implement a statewide recidivism reduction strategy. With that, I tried to keep it short, David.
Thanks very much, Tony. Phoebe's now going to take a few minutes and just talk about some additional supports for recidivism reduction work, and then we will segue right into the question and answers. So, Phoebe?
Thanks, David. Hopefully this morning everybody received an email with a link to our website. Maybe you had a chance to peruse. If not, I think Sean's going to send the link out to the chat function as well. Unfortunately, due to some technical limitations, we can't do a full walkthrough of the website on your screen, but we did put in some screenshots that hopefully you can see just a general idea of the layout, if not the exact content, just to familiarize you all. So the first picture you see here is just a snapshot of both the National Reentry Resource Center kind of page and what that looks like, and then the recidivism reduction checklist and where they live. And going to the site, you can very easily access the PDFs of the 3 checklists, and it also gives a little bit of information, as you'll see on the right-hand side, about the project background. So definitely encourage you to see the site and also share this with your coworkers and other people in your network who might be interested. Going to the next slide, give a little more information just about who falls into these different, audiences. And I think what you may have taken away from the discussion today is that just because you're a state corrections administrator or a coordinator or a staff person doesn't mean you can only use one checklist. There's kind of a lot of different purposes and ways to use the checklist across different audiences. What this audience kind of tells you is who that level of detail in the checklist is intended to be directed at. So you'll see a little extra information about, policymakers also includes their staff. Administrators can also include probation and parole officers. So just a little more context there, but again, access to those PDFs so you can see them. And some additional details, information about what's in the checklist and how to use them. A lot of the information on the site really parallels what we discussed today, so we don't really need to go into details, but just know that it's there. Again, kind of paralleling the information that we just talked about, how to use the checklist. The one thing I do want to highlight for everybody is we do have a section on additional information, as you can see here. So this includes a glossary of key terms and concepts that are used in the checklist that you can access. This is really important, I think, for people who are less familiar with kind of the recidivism reduction, reentry terminology that gets thrown around, which we are guilty of today. It does get very technical sometimes, so that's definitely a good resource to have on hand. And there's 2 links out to other resources that a lot of these checklists really were built from. None of this information is new. It's really just a distillation of a lot of the other research that's out there, so make note of that. All right, so back to you, David.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And that brings us back to the final section, which would be questions and answers. And we do have a few, and some of them are open-ended, and some of them have been specific folks have been asked, and so I'll try to switch back and forth between some of that. One question that I think for anyone who might want to answer, one of our listeners is asking about the issue of training and wondering how other states have addressed the issue of sustainability around training. For them, it's been a problem area at different times. They've utilized the train-the-trainer model, but have found that they tend to lose trainers either because of staff burnout or because of attrition. And so they were just wondering how some other places utilize this and how other folks keep training moving forward. So I would throw that open for any other panelists who might be interested in responding.
Well, this is Justin, and certainly I can respond to that. We started doing evidence-based training back in the late 80s and early 90s, and we started training staff to be trainers, and yes, we saw the same experience with, through attrition, through retirement, through succession planning. People would be promoted and no longer have time to do that. So now we use a combination of all of the above. We use training for trainers, but we also keep people under contract at a national level, whether it's for assessments, whether it's motivational interviewing, whether it's emotional intelligence. And I have found in my 37 years in the business, staff, they appreciate being trained by their peers, but they appear to be more appreciative of trainers that come in from other systems because you get that cross-pollination of experiences and you get a lot more interaction of, oh, how's the system working that you're from, et cetera. So I would answer that question by saying you probably need a combination of both, which in corrections is always having a plan A and a B and let them work at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Any other thoughts?
This is Bridget. I think that what has worked for us is using we use the train-the-trainer model in most cases. And so we have our training staff that are trained as well as our field staff and our institutional staff. And we try to gather people at all different levels so that we are able to ensure that they're going to be career employees. And even when they get promoted, we still ask that they commit. For example, our training on our assessment tool, we are going to be sending out a list of all the trainings for 2013, and then we ask them to commit to being available for at least one of those trainings. So we have had to bring in the master trainers to train additional staff, and we just make every effort to make sure that the staff that agree to training are going to be around for the long haul, but it is a challenge. Regardless of if you have funding to bring a lot of people in from outside the agency, or if you do have trainers within your agency, making sure that they have the time available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, both excellent responses. Certainly, before my career here at the Justice Center, I spent many years working in Connecticut. And one of the things that the Judicial Department did there, which is responsible for much of the oversight, actually oversees the majority of individuals who are in the community, either straight from court or even on a split sentence, is that they actually contracted with a particular agency, not necessarily folks coming in from everywhere, but literally decided to contract with an agency who were to become the trainers, who were to learn all of that, and then they did all of it. That agency was responsible. So it was sort of in the middle of the two. It wasn't train the trainer internally, but it also wasn't just nationally, although they've done that also, but it was sort of creating it as a separate RFP that they put out, and an agency that did that sort of thing responded and became sort of now for a number of years provides the training both for the Judicial Department staff and also for a number of the agencies that the Judicial Department contracts with and wants the services from them. So you have some clear crossover and ability to measure what's happening. Another question, Dr. Dennis, are you there?
Yes, I am.
One of our listeners was wondering, so this is great. We're talking about this in terms of how it is that this program will do this or how it is the department will do it. But they're kind of wondering, what about globally? How is BJA or how would different funders think about this in terms of having an impact on corrections policy and practice?
Well, I think we've made some significant strides, David, with the advent 2 years ago of the Attorney General's Reentry Council. We have this fourth meeting of this particular council, which is composed of all the cabinet secretaries. They meet twice a year, and we have secretaries of education, labor, housing and urban development, along with various other groups like Veterans Affairs. But what we're doing is we're trying to, and I think we're doing a relatively good job of pulling together the federal resources and the various grant programs, Health and Human Services, that have an interest in returning offenders and reentry. So I think particularly in the Obama administration, you're seeing a significant emphasis on collaborative efforts at the federal level to provide resources and to leverage those resources. Of course, BJA is continuing to fund, and we anticipate getting some level of appropriation this year for additional Second Chance Act programs, Section 101 demonstration projects, as well as career technology and mentoring and programs for co-occurring disorders. So I think that you can look to see BJA continuing to support the work of the National Reentry Resource Center and the work that is going on through the Urban Institute to continue to build on the What Works library. So while we are obviously in an era of diminishing resources, given the situation with sequester and the budget problems, there is still a strong bipartisan commitment on the part of the Congress and a strong commitment on the part of this administration to provide resources. And I think the development and the funding of the work, like the development of these checklists, is an indication of our efforts to try to develop tools that can be used globally and that have generalizability to various jurisdictions. Is that helpful?
Great, yes. Thanks very much. Yes, I think very much so. We have another question, and I think given what you were discussing earlier, Director Wall, this may make sense for you, though anyone can respond certainly. You were talking about the issue of talking with policymakers or the public, and one of the questions was, so what types of forums would make sense to do that in? How would we create those sorts of things?
I would say that we want to take advantage of every opportunity. Certainly, an important one is hearings before the state legislature. Our departments all have various hearings before various committees, I'm sure, the Judiciary or Corrections Committee, the Finance Committee, and we're generally afforded an opportunity to make an initial presentation. And I would say that that's a really significant place to make our points. I also think it's very helpful in talking to our own staff, in giving them the insights that we've learned, and in any community forums that are described. I go back again to Tony's example of the different opinions people had about the way revocations were being handled in Wisconsin and how it was an opportunity to educate folks that it really isn't what you think. So I'm a believer that we knock on every door and accept every opportunity and get our staff to a level where there can be more than one messenger and more than one ambassador, so that everybody is out there saying the same thing, regardless of whether it's the director, senior staff, program, custody, community corrections, coordinators, whomever.
Great. Thank you. And would anybody else like to add anything to that? Okay. Well, we have another question from the listener. Let's see. Is there a common or fundamental type of programming philosophy, such as CBT or moral recognition, that's advised for use by the states to accomplish the 50% goal of recidivism reduction? Well, let me, I think I'll make some initial responses, and then anyone can add on to that. I think the first one is, as you might recall, early on, Dr. Dennis indicated that while that was in the legislature, that we do know that the likelihood of 50% reduction of recidivism in any particular given year or two or three is really highly unlikely, and I think that it would be very fair of me to say that there is no program or programming philosophy that we can point to that creates that type of recidivism reduction in any rapid fashion. I think it is equally fair to say that when you ask about CBT or moral reclamation therapy. CBT, of course, is the sort of overarching construct of cognitive behavioral therapy, and actually it's cognitive behavioral interventions. It tends to be skills training, whereas therapy is yet another level, if you will. We do know that cognitive behavioral interventions or responses are the most effective from a responsivity perspective in terms of recidivism reduction, so that the programming should be cognitive behavioral in nature. Moral reclamation therapy is one of those types of responses. Thinking for a change is another that is used very commonly. Reasoning and rehabilitation is another that has enjoyed some degree of success, and all three of them have shown to slightly varying degrees clear impact in terms of lowering recidivism. There are some others that are being worked on right now, particularly at the University of Cincinnati, and then there are some others that are used in other countries but haven't necessarily been tested or validated specifically here. So we do know that the sort of fundamental recommendation is programming really needs to be cognitive behavioral in nature, and it needs to be a program that has been validated. Traditionally, we're talking about manualized kinds of programs that are utilized for recidivism reduction. Now, where people get stuck sometimes is they say, but there's other needs that people have. Absolutely. Nobody is suggesting that other needs should be ignored. But you have to think of it as sort of a sequencing issue. If you don't deal with the criminal thinking pieces, if you don't deal with the high-risk issues that are most likely to cause that individual to fail, then providing the other services will not help them. It will simply pass the time until they fail. And so the issue becomes, how is it that you provide the appropriate cognitive behavioral responses or recidivism reduction types of programming so that you can help people survive? And then, on top of that, what are the other types of things that they need? Now, the one caveat to what I just said is that there are some folks, for example, with significant substance abuse needs or significant mental health needs, but you cannot do the criminogenic thinking response. You can't do the programming to reduce risk of recidivism before that. You either have to do it at the same time, or you may have to resolve those problems first in order for the individual to be able to benefit from that programming. So it often becomes one of sequencing. But if you're focusing on recidivism reduction, CBT currently is clearly the way to go and the most effective set of responses that we have in our arsenal. Continue to be working on others, but to not do that now is essentially akin to not providing something that's reducing recidivism among the population. Tony, anybody else want to add to that?
David, this is A.T. I think that it's become clear to the field that we do need to begin with the so-called cognitive factors, antisocial attitudes, pro-criminal associates, people that you hang around with, certain temperamental factors like egocentricity, relentless aggressiveness, so forth, and certainly a history of antisocial behavior. And it was crystallized for me by something that Professor Latessa from the University of Cincinnati once said. He said, we're in a period of very high unemployment, but not everybody without a job is going out and committing a crime. Employment is important, but you have to address the attitudes, temperaments, and companions first.
Absolutely. Again, that issue of sequencing, yes. Thanks very much. Let's see. We have one here. We have time for just a couple more. We have one here, research. So I'm thinking maybe, Tony. Question about, can the checklist be used to inform the state's research priorities? So maybe even a step further than we were mentioning earlier, Tony. Can it help inform, say, the planning and data collection strategies or the general research strategies? I'm wondering if you might share some thoughts about that.
Yeah, very good question. And by the way, I've tried to respond to the last question, but you actually have to take your mute off, I found out. Yeah, actually, I could speak to that from a personal standpoint. In terms of prioritizing research, if you will, I'm going to hope actually two things are going to happen with this checklist. One, if you can actually have legislators talking the same talk as correctional administrators and what we're doing in terms of a reentry strategy, One of the things I've been frustrated from the research and evaluation of the world is having access to either other state agency data that help us refine some of what we do in terms of recidivism tracking, such as having access to NCIC data through our respective Department of Justice, or starting looking at factors that are related to either success or failure of on supervision or recidivism, et cetera, such as having employment data that we have been, it's been a little challenging for us to do that. So with this then, if we get people to actually start talking the same language, we need to measure these things because they're critical to be able to look at. And one of those obviously is recidivism. And in order to do it in a more comprehensive way, we need to be able to access to these type of data. It would help leverage the agencies or the administration to be able to say, let's make this happen somehow so that we're able to actually report this in an accurate and defensible manner.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I am looking at my clock. It's looking like it's 3:57 or 3:58. I know that Phoebe has a couple of closing and concluding comments, and so one, I would like to thank the panelists very much for their insights and their help in this presentation. I'd like to thank everybody that's been listening and appreciate the large number of you that have called in and joined and the questions that you've asked. And with that, I will turn it over to Phoebe for a couple of concluding remarks. Phoebe?
Thanks, David, and double thanks to all the panelists. Echo David's thoughts. It was really informative and useful webinar. So for everyone on the call, this concludes our webinar for today. After you exit the webinar, you're going to see that a brief survey will appear on your screen. By answering the questions in that survey, you will really be helping the Resource Center improve the services that we offer. So we'd greatly appreciate it if you could just take a few minutes to complete that survey. Also, we will be emailing a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as a link to the PDF of the PowerPoint slides that are used in the presentation early next week. Those links will also be made available on the National Reentry Resources Center website, www.nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. And finally, I just want to note that if anybody is interested in additional assistance or information, training around the checklist, that I encourage you to reach out to us. You can email me directly. I think most of you have my contact information at this point, but my email is potter@csg.org, and we'd be happy to provide any additional information to people who are looking to use these checklists within their corrections departments. So thank you, everyone, for participating.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.